afternoon. Everybody dried off a little bit. Today's topic is on wormseed. Larry Haines was born in Woodbine, Maryland. He attended Mount Airy High School and Frederick Community College. He's a former dairy farmer and is currently a real estate broker and appraiser. Larry was a member of the Maryland Association of Realtors from 1986 to 1990, and he was honored by the National Association of Realtors with the status of Realtor Emeritus. Larry was also a member of the Maryland State Senate from 1991 to 2011, serving as Minority Whip from 2001 to 2002, and on many various committees and subcommittees. He and his wife Jane have 4 sons, 9 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. Edwin Magin grew up working on the family farms in the Taylorsville area for 25 years. He graduated from Mount Airy High School and began working at Sweetheart Cub, retiring after 38 years. Edwin has volunteered at the Carroll Farm Museum for the past 8 years. He's on the farm's wormseed committee and gives presentations and tours of the wormseed exhibits. Edwin and the committee are currently in the process of setting up a wormseed distillery. Larry will start first and tell us about the intensive handwork that's essential to growing a wormseed crop, and Edwin will then explain the distilling process that nets the wormseed oil. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone that's gathered here today. It's the first time I've been to one of the Historical Society's box lunch talks, so I want to promise you one thing. Our program today is unrehearsed, but there's probably nobody in the world that knows more about growing and harvesting and distilling wormseed than Ed Magin and his family. And I had the privilege of being part of a family where wormseed was a big part of our lives. I grew up on a farm in the Winfield Woodbine area, and to give you a little history, it wasn't in my introduction, but I grew up in a log house on Bethel Road near Gillis Road, and my father had a wormseed distillery from 1928 until 1942. But that old house we lived in had running water. You'd run down to the spring and you'd run back. And that's very true. Also, when we wanted to use the toilet, it was too far away in the winter, but it's too close in the summer. So that's a little bit of my background. I even recall when they put electricity in the old farmhouse, I was in the first grade at Winfield Elementary School. So that's some background, but wormseed was a big part of my life as a boy growing up, and also as a young adult. My dad grew wormseed, and it was something that it was just automatic. It was like getting up in the morning and going to work. We talked wormseed quite often. And I see a number of folks here in the audience today. There's some folks here that actually helped me grow and harvest some of my wormseed. The Doxsons right here. And they were just youngsters. I was their senior. And I'm sure I taught them a good work ethic because growing wormseed is very hard work. So I'm going to start out and give you a little explanation regarding the seed. The seed that we use to grow the wormseed plants, that seed was reserved from a prior crop. What we did is we'd reserve about 3 or 4 choice stalks of the wormseed from the prior crop, and we would store it in granary bags, hang it in the barn where it was dry. And then when it came time to plant the seeds in the wormseed bed, we'd actually thresh those stalks out by hand and get the seed. Now, the wormseed bed was an important part of the growing of wormseed. First of all, we would select a wooded area. It had to have a southern exposure where it would get the warmth of the sun, because we started making the wormseed bed in February. We usually planted the seeds about 1st of March or mid-March. But getting that bed ready was quite a chore. It was very work intensive. We would clear the trees out of an area, probably no more than 4,000 or 5,000 square feet of woodland. What stumps we could pull and dig out, we would do that. Some of the larger stumps, we did not remove those, but we would work the ground up. We usually had one horse and a small spring-tooth harrow, and we were able to work the ground up. We used mattocks. We dug a lot of the roots up and the small stumps by hand, and it was fertile woods soil where leaves had deteriorated and became part of that fertile soil. And also, when you go into a wooded area, you didn't have the seeds from the weeds that would grow out in the fields, so it was a limited amount of weed seed in those beds. And we would just work the ground up and work it up until it was almost like a flower bed. And then we would sow the worm seeds. We would broadcast them around the 1st of March. And we'd use some fertilizer, number 312-6, to mix with the seeds and broadcast it. And then we had this job of packing it down. And as youngsters, we would get on there and tramp and pack the bed down. So it was packed down real tight. And of course, as soon as we got some moisture and that warm sun would start coming in, those plants would start to grow. And we usually pulled the plants to be transplanted when they reached the height of about 6 to 8 inches tall. And those plants were very sturdy plants. And as we pulled those, which was about the 1st to the middle of June, is when we started the process of transplanting the plants from that worm seed bed. Then we had to prepare the field. We would usually plow, our average at our home was 5 to 7 acres of worm seed. And we'd plow the ground with a moldboard plow, 8 inches to 10 inches deep, and work the ground up very thoroughly. And then the transplanting, we had to pull these plants one at a time. And they were usually, depending on the farmer, 36-inch wide rows or 40 or 42-inch wide rows. And the plants would be planted somewhere between 15 to 20 inches apart. So the plant population per acre was somewhere between 8 and 10,000 plants per acre. So if you take a 7-acre tract, that's a lot of plants to pull one at a time. But then the transplanting of it, our planter was a new idea transplanter. It had a water barrel on the back. And I think Ed has a picture of one of those new idea planters that he'll be showing behind us. And the planter was pulled with horses. My dad farmed with horses up until 1950. And 2 horses, old Don and Betty, were the horses. And me and my brother would sit on the seats on this plant. And as he would drive the horses, of course, the water was regulated to come out like 18 or 20 inches apart. And we had to be certain that as we were setting those plants down in that shoe between the packer wheels, that we had to actually hit that water. We couldn't miss the water because that's what saved the plants. And my dad stood up on this tank driving the horses. And we were just small kids. And if we would miss a plant, his foot was right there. He could tap us upside the ear and say, "Don't do that again." But we became pretty expert in transplanting and replanting worm seed. Now, not every one of those plants lived, not every one. So after a rain, we would replant the plants that missed, and we'd use a small wooden peg to do that. It was just a handmade peg, and we would go out, and the plants that were dying or appeared to be dying, we would replant and replace that because we wanted to get that 8 to 10,000 plant population per acre. And that was the process that we had to use. So then we had to be very certain that we tended this crop very faithfully. Now, worm seed didn't attract any insects. We didn't have to worry about pesticides. We didn't have weed killer, but if we did, we couldn't use it because actually worm seed was a weed plant itself. And the spray that you'd use to control weeds in corn would kill worm seed. So we had to cultivate it, and we cultivated with horses up until 1950. And we made sure that we could keep all the weeds out of it. By 1950, I was 12 years old, and I decided to approach my dad and say, "Dad, that old Oliver 70 tractor doesn't pull a worm seed planter. It's got steel wheels and it's too big. And you're going to quit farming with these horses. We need a tractor." So I started the search, and when I was 12 years old, I located a Farmall A tractor. It had a vacuum lift to lift the cultivator, so 1-row cultivator to cultivate this worm seed. And I approached my dad, and he said, "Oh, Larry, a tractor will cost $1,000. There's no way we can spend $1,000. And I said, "Well, we can use our wormseed money." He said, "If you want a tractor," he said, "maybe you ought to see what you can do yourself." Well, some of you here can probably recall that we had school savings accounts in those days. We put a few pennies or a few nickels a week in a school savings. He said, "How much money you got?" I said, $42. "Oh, that's not enough." Well, he finally agreed, and we bought this tractor for $500. It wasn't a play toy, it was a workhorse. And I used that tractor to cultivate that worm seed. Neighbors would hire me to cultivate their worm seed because a lot of people, because of the price between 1950 and 1960, was up around $7.50 to $8.50 a pound. And people that worked at other jobs, if they had an acre or two, they'd plant it in worm seed, but they didn't have the equipment to cultivate it. They would hire me out. So it only took me that 1 year to pay for that tractor. And it's sort of a blessing to have a tractor like that on a farm. And it was very, very special. But we also had to hoe this worm seed. We wanted to make sure that every weed was out of it. We had the morning glories, the running vines, the crabgrass, the thistle. We made sure that not one of those survived at all. We wanted it perfectly clean, no weeds, no weeds. And then the growing process of that worm seed began. And of course, we need rain. Farmers are at risk. They say farming's a gamble, but the rain sure did help. But we always had a pretty successful crop of the worm seed. And it was a very, very special time of year, especially the date that we're in now in August is when all the cultivating was completed. The worm seed was happily finishing its growth. And by the time we got to the time to cut and harvest the worm seed, it would be about the middle of September each year, about the middle of September. And distilleries would be open. The distillery boilers had to be inspected by the state of Maryland. I have copies of the boiler certificates where my dad's still was inspected by the state. It could not exceed 125 pounds pressure on that boiler. It was a safety precaution to make sure that they weren't carrying too much pressure that they could actually explode. And it was a time of year in September when the state representative came around. Yesterday, the Carroll County Times ran a copy of the boiler certificate in the Reflections article of the Carroll County Times, where my dad's boiler was inspected, I think it was 1940. And the inspection fee is what I looked at. What do you think it costs to have the boiler inspected by the state of Maryland? $1. State of Maryland today would probably charge you a lot more, right? But it's kind of interesting to see that. And I don't remember the wormseed distillery my dad had because I was 4 years old in 1942, and I think that's when he discontinued use of it. It was a smaller boiler. But the other wormseed distilleries that were in the immediate area, Ed Magin's grandfather and his father, his family, had the distillery down on Route 27, about a mile north of Taylorsville. And that was a very popular distillery, and Ed's going to talk more about that. A man by the name of Gus Fleming had one on Fleming Road that's located between Gillish Road and Braddock Road. That was 2 kettles. His kettles were about 6 feet across in diameter by about 7 or 8 feet deep. There was a large distillery in Woodbine on John Pickett Road. A gentleman named John Pickett built the largest distillery that was in the county. It was 4 kettles, and they were huge kettles. It had, the boiler had a big brick smokestack. There's some remnants of that distillery left there, but not much. But that was one of the largest distilleries. A man named Austin Perigoy from Manchester bought the business. It also had a canning factory, and he ran the distillery. And the charge when he took it over, the distiller charged 50 cents a pound to distill the oil. Now, wormseed was sold by the pound, not by the gallon. Some of you are dairy farmers. You know, we sell milk by the pound too. We don't sell it by the gallon. And what they did, Mr. Fleming, I think, was 40 cents a pound to distill it. I don't know what the Vegas, maybe
75.
They got up to 75 cents. But Mr. Perigoy, I walked into the distillery one day where the oil's drawn off, and he had a sign up. He said, due to the volume of work, I'm raising my price to $1 a pound. Signed at H.A. Paraguay. And I never forget that because I was growing my own crops then, and that was the distillery that I was using. But Jane and I, my wife and I, grew our last crop in 1961. And the distillery on John Pickett Road had closed. The one down in Morgan that was operated by the Grimes family had closed down. The Magin's distillery, I think, was still working. It worked up until
1966.
1966. But I was in the Woodbine area, the southern part of Carroll County, and there was a distillery over in Kemptown. And we hauled our wormseed over to Kemptown to be distilled. And that distillery is still in existence over there. It hasn't been used since 1978. After the market for wormseed declined to the point where nobody grew it anymore in the 60s, that distillery continued to operate, but they sold the oil for use in perfume to a perfume company. And I think that distillery closed down in 1978. But the market, because of other products and synthetics and whatever that replaced wormseed oil, and wormseed oil was used for the treatment of parasites and worms in animals and in humans. And there were some reports that some of it was used in paints to paint the bottoms of ships that would prohibit the barnacles from getting on the ships. So there was a big, huge market. The highest price that I can remember was $11.50 a pound for the oil. Probably the average yield on the wormseed was 60 to 70 pounds per acre. My last crop, I know the 7 acres was nearly 100 pounds of oil per acre. But if you go back when they started growing wormseed in this county to 1840, and it was distilled in small pots of probably 5 to 8 gallon with a soapstone type seal on it. I don't know how many, but there could have been hundreds of these small distilleries in Carroll County in that century. And the price, can you imagine if a farmer maybe only had 10 pounds but got $11.50 a pound in 1860? What a cash crop that was for them. Quite a lot of money in those days. But everything that we purchased pretty much on the farm when it comes to new equipment, a truck or an automobile or whatever, usually wormseed oil, the cash crop, is what paid the bill. It's what paid the bill. I was able to buy a new tractor when I was 14 because of wormseed oil. I was able to buy a new car when I was 16 because of wormseed oil. Some of these guys probably rode in it. They probably wouldn't ride with me today. I'm not wild enough, okay? But wormseed, we looked forward to it. And the Magin family, I guess it was your grandfather had the country store in Taylorsville.
It would have been my uncle.
Your uncle. He bought wormseed oil, but he would carry people. Money was tight. And he would carry people on credit till he sold the wormseed oil. I recall those days, them being able to do that. So that gives you a little bit of background on how we reserved the seed from a prior crop, how we protected the seed, how we located the area in the woods along the edge on a southern exposure to plant those seeds. And then those plants had to be pulled one at a time. They were planted one at a time. And the cutting of the wormseed, we had to wait until it was mature, or we'd say ripe, because those little black seeds is what we had to preserve. And we had homemade wormseed cutters. We would take a used cross-cut saw. We would cut out lengths about 10 or 12 inches long of an old 6-foot cross-cut saw. And then we'd use discarded fork handles or some type handles, and we'd make our own wormseed cutters. We'd sharpen the blades on both sides, and we'd resharpen those every day almost, because cutting wormseed was a lot of stony ground. Those things got real dull, and you had to cut the wormseed stalk about an inch or two under the ground. You would push it over and hack it. I think Ed has some pictures
I got it
back there showing you how we cut this wormseed. Now, one of the gentlemen said his back still hurt from it. My back doesn't still hurt from it. But the worm seed, I was the loader. I got on the wagon after it was cut. Now we had to let it lay in the field anywhere from 6, 7, 8 days, depending on the weather, to cure it, to get it dry. And then the process of loading it on the wagons or the truck, what we needed to do was load it when there was a lot of dew on it so it wouldn't shatter in the seeds. If you lost the seeds, you lost the oil. So the process of loading it was usually at night, maybe after 9 or 10 o'clock when the heavy dew started falling, or you get up early in the morning, 3 or 4 o'clock, and start loading it with the heavy dew on it. When the dew began to get dry, you quit loading. And I was usually the loader. So you wanted to make sure you dressed for it. You wanted to have your shirt buttoned real tight. You wanted to have a cap on. You wanted to have, we used one-piece overalls and tied the legs around the boot at the bottom. We wanted to make sure no seeds got down in our shoes. However, some did. And the result of that was the fact that because of the worm seed getting on your skin, it caused your feet to burn or your hands to burn. It was like you're frostbitten. and I think I've sort of grown out of that, but it took many years from loading worm seed to know that the worm seed was the cause of the sore feet. So it's quite a it was quite a process. I mean, everything was hand labor. Just everything was hand labor. Everything that we did, except for when I got that farm away with a vacuum lift and a one-row cultivator and a little 12-year-old skinny kid. I see my brother out here, Don Haines. He remembers me as a 9-year-old riding around on an Oliver 70 with steel wheels. And you had to crank it. Of course, I would park it on a real steep hill so I could drift it and start it because I couldn't crank it. But Don is a very gifted, talented writer. And there's a book in the Historical Society, the history of the Haines and the Bair families, B-A-I-R families, and he has about 7 pages, an excellent account of the worm seed from its beginning to the oil being distilled and to the sale of the oil. So you can check on that sometimes. And Kevin Dayhuff, I saw him come in. He interviewed me 8, 9, 10 years ago about worm seed. His grandfather, Earl Wright, down on Gillis Road, grew worm seed. And we were just sitting at a table and interviewed him, and we talked about it. And it ended up in some of the newspapers somewhere. So I do have a copy of it now. I never knew that it was ever put into print. But I think my time's about up. And Ed's going to share the distilling process. Now, I'll talk to you about loading the worm seed on the wagon or the truck, getting it to the distillery, and then it had to be loaded into the kettles. And then the steam process, the condensation process. So he'll take you through some of that. And then if there's questions about anything, I'm sure that we can help you out with questions. But the Magin family were the kings of worm seed. There's no question about that. They were really into it. They have a lot of photographs. I don't know. I often tell people my family's so poor we didn't own a camera. But we have very few photographs. I have one of my grandfather when he was 92 years old in 1956 on a Sunday on his birthday, sitting in front of a field of worm seed with his necktie on. Folks back then dressed up to sit in the yard on Sunday. Come home from church and sit in the yard. So Ed, you go ahead. If there's anything that I can add to it, you can ask me. But we really appreciate the fact that the artifacts that Ed has and others that we're going to be in the collection process because we plan on moving this one distillery out to the Farm Museum. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you. I've been volunteering at the Farm Museum probably back the last 8 years, I guess. And one of the first things I ask the people coming through is where they're from. And I'd like to ask this audience how many really knew anything about worm seed. See, it's a few around, and I always get that. I get a few that when they come through the Farm Museum, they do know what I'm talking about. Most of them don't. So when we have the wine festival there, I even get people from the foreign countries that's really interested in everything. But getting back to where our distill was located, it was out at Taylorsville, right below Sames Creek Road. And we operated that probably close to 50 years. I had one article. My grandfather really started the distill, and his father-in-law and him as a Wright, I think it was Clarence Wright, they never got along with each other. They actually had a still on, Clarence Wright did on the Sames Creek Road. So my grandfather and him never got along, so my grandfather built one down along 27 then. And that's where he got started. My grandfather's name was George W. Magin. And then, of course, my dad, which was his right name was Francis Magin, and they really was known as Buck. And my uncle Donald was the one running the wormseed still there at Taylorsville then. So in the process of loading, I'm going to try to work this along as we go. As Larry mentioned, that's my uncle loading right there, Donald. You can see him loading the wormseed right there. That's how it's loaded, with a long fork like that. Then I'm going to the next one here. That's a team of horses bringing it back in, probably in the 40s to our wormseed still. That's the horses bringing the load in. And there's older photograph, but you can see your older wagons with loaded wormseed in the truck there on the way to a wormseed distill. That's another wormseed distill, which I'm not too familiar which one that is, but that's another wormseed distill in the county. That's a picture of our wormseed distill at Taylorsville. That's another one there. In other words, what was the process? You went taking the load in on after it was cut and everything would go in on one side, your green, where they're standing, the gentleman standing there. You take it in on that side, and then you pitch it off into kettles. And we had two of them. They were 7 foot deep and then 6 foot wide. And then where the tractor is, after it was cooked, it would come out on that side then. That's my dad, my grandfather there, and then Leonard C. Burns, their former county agent. There, that big tank there you see is a re-distill then. You had to have a re-distill after it come down, and you dip your oil off, but the state got after us, you know, to pass inspection. It was going out in the stream and everything, so they had to get it re-distilled after you dipped some off because it was going out in the stream. And of course, the state would shut us down if we didn't have that re-distilled, so we had to get it re-distilled after it was distilled some. After you dipped the oil off, there was still something you had to catch everything before you entered the stream bed. So that's a re-distilled tank there, that's what that is. There it shows them on load, and I think that's down at, I think it's down at Woodbine there. There it shows them pitching it in to the kettles there. Yeah. This is ours. This is our kettles here too. The kettles I was telling you about. That's what they was pitching off, and that's actually my cousin there packing the kettles in. Now you see them. That's what's interesting. A lot of them. Why are you doing that? Well, you stop it. It was divided in two sections, and to lift it out, and to get more in, we all got on there and jumped it down so we could get it because the stalks was there. So you jump it down and get as much as you can in the kettles then. There it shows another one after it's already cooking, and another one where they're pitching it in. Okay, there's where it's coming out after it's cooked in. You can see it, and then that come out in a chain like that. They actually had a tractor to lift it up, and pull the rope, and then pull the chains over that way, but you had a tractor out at the other end, and that would pull and lift it up, the whole thing then. So it was went over a carriage like you would hay over, you lift it up then, and that actually was put in two different sections in the kettle. That's one half of the kettle coming out there then. So what would we do with the cooked stalks after they were like that? They were taken out on the field, A lot of times we put the cooked herb where you sow wheat or something, washed or something, we put that down, we spread over the fields or dished it in, and everything after it was cooked. We also thrash the seed sometimes, and I think some of the seed was sent to feed companies or something. It was ground up that way and it was used that way. And even the green seed was saved and fell off after he was pitching it off. Then the cooked seed would, all the seeds a lot of times would fall off in between the process. There shows some donkeys eating some after it was cooked. They wouldn't eat it. You couldn't eat it while it was in the green stage because that was poison. Okay, there's where it shows down at the woodbine. That shows where your oil's coming out then, going in the drums then.
That's the John Pickett's.
That's probably down there too, right, Larry? Where they got the 4.
That's the John Pickett stills on Woodbine Road. Had 4 kettles.
There it shows some drain the oil then. Says going out the bottom, and it's down in that little trough there. It's a possibility that some of it would run out. That's where you had to get redistill in, because you got water running out of it. And you're wondering how did we get it cooked? Well, it was a process after it was steamed and everything. It was cooked for about a half hour, and that come up through the bottom. And then it would condense and go down through a cooling trough. Okay. And then when you get down to the lower end, naturally your oil's going to come up on top. So your oil was dipped off. That's how they dipped it off then. Okay, that's what I was just explaining there. There's your cooling trough coming down from where the kettles were then. That's my dad there. You see the little bottle, that's he's tested. He tested whether it was done cooking and everything, the little bottle. He'd stick that under there and check it, see whether it was done cooking enough then. How much oil was on it, whether it was done ready to be cooked, finished cooking. And that's my Uncle Donald dipping some oil in. That's my grandfather pouring some in a jug. Some of it used to be put in jugs, very big jugs, and small jugs like that. That's a sample of the wormseed oil. Now it would look something like that, or it could be real light yellow. I've seen real light yellow light. That was the first wormseed oil I raised, and that's what I was paid $800 for the crop I grew when I was in a project for the school, FFA. I grew that. I got $820 for 200 pounds. 1966, this is what happened. That was the last we distilled. It was tore down. I was really disappointed because I really wanted to go to the farm museum. And that didn't happen. Reason why, we were willing to give it to them, but the county said, well, you got to pay for hauling it. So that was the end of that. So it was sold, as far as I know, to Oliver Ridgely. And from what I understand, it went to a peanut farmer, eventually went to a peanut farmer in Georgia. Because you could really cook stuff, even mint or anything like that with it. That's what happened to it in 1966. When we stopped, this was 1980. I'll take us back. 1980 is when it was tore down. 1966 is when we really stopped distilling. But 1980 is when it was tore down. That's what's there now. And it's got a bunch of pine trees right in front of it. You can barely see them. They got a pond there, I think, was left in where we just stored some of the building there. I think that's still there, where we just stored some of the oil and everything. That's it.
That's all you got?
Very good. I'm going to say this already if you want. I got a couple notes.
Read the thing about your dad.
Oh, yeah, I'll do that too. I got a book here. I want to read an article where my dad went to New York to take some oil up there. One thing Ken mentioned here, let me put this thing. This mark right there. 2,000 pounds of oil was still every 24 hours. Acre wormseed plants could yield, like Larry said, between 45 and 60, maybe 70 pounds per acre. Wormseed was beginning in, I think, compared to in corn, wormseed brought maybe $1,500, I mean not $1,500 an acre for corn, wormseed, and corn was bringing roughly $300, $400 an acre. So that's the difference between wormseed and the corn. Now, I don't know, comparing corn now, what they're bringing and compared to that now, I don't know. Okay, my dad wrote this article in, was it Carroll Lee's Legend of the Land? I'm going to read this to you. My father, George Magin, and my brother Donald and I were in the wormseed oil business in Taylorsville area. The family grew as much as 50 acres a year. We operated still beside Maryland Route 27 north of Taylorsville until the demand of oil faded out in the 60s. The still consisted of a steam boiler, which we started out with coal and ended up with oil. In fact, they call them vats, but we call them kettles, but 6 feet in diameter and 7 feet deep. Within, let the steam out at the bottom and the outlet on top, and piping and condensing pipes in the water trough. The condensed water and oil was collected and separated. The oil rose to the top and the water was drawn off from the bottom. The oil was stored in drums. We used a planter to set the wormseed plants in rows, 8 to 10,000 plants per acre, with about 500 pounds of fertilizer per acre. The crop was cut when the seeds were darkened and allowed to cure in the field for a few days before loading on wagons and to be taken to the still. My grandfather ran the still on the day shift along with my dad. And my uncle, Donald, was the night operator, for we run it 24-hour shifts, 6 days a week, never on Sunday. In the season, we brought, and actually our season probably started in September. I know sometimes it went clean to November. And they'd always wanted to make sure they would stop before Thanksgiving because they'd like to go hunting down Virginia. Donald and I decided to take a truck, a 4-ton load of oil valued at $56,000 to dealers in New York, in Manhattan. One November, we started one night, a truck loaded of drums, and arrived in New York before the opening of a business. Parked the truck, took a nap, and an employee of the firm awakened us, and they opened the door to an elevator. We drove the truck in. We and the truck and all were taken 11 floors, 11th floor. The drug company paid for the oil in 30 to 60 days. We asked about a hotel room, and our friend called the hotel and told the manager that he had 2 country boys wanting a room, and to give them room high up as they were not used to street noises. That's wrote by my dad, Francis Buck Magin. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
We have a little more time. One issue, no one's ever asked me this question, but serving in government, I thought about it. What are the environmental risks of wormseed oil getting into our streams? I'm not certain of the date, but it was somewhere maybe in the 1920s to 1930 where it became an issue. Now, the oil was tested for weight. The oil is lighter in water, so the oil would rise to the top. They draw the water off of the bottom of the vat that received the condensation. And there was some heavier oil that escaped the distillers, and because it was heavy, like water, and it was passed off and went into the stream. The government came out because there were some fish kills. This story was related to me. I think it's fact, and I think my brother might be able to confirm it. They came out and they required, and it became a really a windfall for the wormseed growers. The government required, the regulations required them to build a pond to catch this heavy oil. And by catching this heavy oil, it had to be redistilled. You saw a redistill tank here, where that heavy oil with some water was redistilled, and it captured that. So actually, the growers actually increased their yield probably a couple pounds per kettle, 2 to 3 pounds per kettle, by putting in a settlement pond to catch this heavier oil mixed with water. So it was a good measure. Today, I don't know if we were still distilling wormseed oil, what the requirements might be. It would be very difficult probably to get an approval for an operating wormseed distillery today based on environmental regulations, because they become more stringent and more stringent each year, it seems. But it happened to be a windfall. Is that correct, Don? Okay. But you saw the redistilled tank, and do people have questions? Speak up so I can hear you, because I'm getting that stage in life where I have a little.
Shock me.
Won't shock you.
It looks a lot like a cattle prod. I have two questions. No one mentioned brokers. It's my understanding that maybe men in bad financial shape when it distilleries oil, someone would buy it, hold it until they got enough to go to New York and sell it. And they never got all the hard work involved. They just bought it at a low price, held on to it. And the other is, it's my understanding that wormseed grew better in shaly ground. Is that correct?
Well, my experience was the one farm I rented on Grimville Road, Woodbine, was a stone patch, and it grew great wormseed. It was sure hard to work. You gentlemen there remember that. I had you picking up stones many times, right? But that is true. And the other question was about the sale of the oil. There were middlemen. Now, a lot of the distillers bought the oil from the growers and resold it, and it was shipped to New York. But there were other people that got into the market. I don't want to mention the names. Well, we know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
And yes, sir, I can't get into that story. It's been settled. However, most distillers we consider to be very honest people. But the ones that weren't distillers that got into the market, there was concern there. And then there were some farmers who got together on one occasion and decided, there's 3 growers, I believe, to haul their own oil to New York and to sell it direct to the brokers up there. Because it's handled through brokers and then resold to pharmaceutical companies. Yes, question here.
Did women have any part in the industry? Women.
Women.
Did women have any part in the wormseed industry?
Women were a big part. The family farm was a big part. I remember before I was old enough, my mother actually rode the wormseed planter. My dad was left-handed and she was right-handed, and rode the planter to set the plants. They also went to the wormseed bed to help pull the plants. The plants were pulled and they were put in bushel baskets. And I can see my mom today doing that work. Women, they didn't go out in the field and load at night, but here's what the women did do. We would go out in the field, and at night, as soon as the dew fell enough to start loading the worm seed on wagons or trucks, and we might come in at 11 o'clock, and my mother would have food on the table, hot coffee, hot chocolate for people to drink, and same thing in the morning. So when we grew up on the farm, I didn't have a store-bought hamburger until Leroy and Jay Connolly opened a store in Winfield. I was probably 11 years old. So the women played an important role. My mother could even harness a horse. She wasn't very big, but she had a lot of muscle. And hard workers. So they had a big role. Yes, sir. Skip.
Show you how long ago I went to pharmacy school. In the senior year, we had a course called cosmetics. And of course, we talked about wormseed oil. And they actually ran a bus trip from the pharmacy school in Baltimore out to Mr. Magin's distillery every year to see how wormseed oil was distilled. And the guys, of course, in Baltimore thought we were coming to the end of the world. They came out of that. But we actually came out, and Mr. Magin's dad, Buck, gave us a great tour of wormseed oil.
Great. Well, there's certain colognes now. I've had some cologne that I can detect the smell of wormseed oil in it. I guess it's used for a basis. It's still used in it was used in perfumes, and that's why the distillery over in Montgomery County, I guess, is still intact. It operated until 1978. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, what else do they use it in besides cosmetics?
It was used in paint. That was used to paint the ships to keep the barnacles off. It was used for treatment of parasites and worms. The South American countries purchased a lot of it because of hookworms and pinworms, and the Rockefellers were big purchasers of it because they had a lot of interest in treating people with medical problems in South American countries. So it was a number of uses. You can go on the internet today and put in wormseed, and you can buy a bottle of wormseed extract. I don't know. I would not. I would not buy it. I would not use it. I guess it's safe, but wormseed oil is poison. And there is a I don't think it's folklore. I think it's a true story. And I know the family where a gentleman got a bottle of wormseed oil instead of his whiskey bottle and drank it and died instantly. Brother, is that true? There you go. And we know the family. Harold Robertson might know.
I wouldn't listen to that exactly, but talking about brokers, my father told me he worked for Ray Brown over at Winfield. It's now Shamrock Farm, you know where that is.
Sure.
383 acres. But my dad worked for Mr. Brown, and in 1932 he said he mixed wormseed oil at night because it was priced according to specific gravity, and to get the optimum specific gravity he would mix different specific gravity batches. But Ray Brown was a broker, you might say, and he did own Shamrock Farm, which is now owned by the owner of Pittsburgh Steel, I think.
Okay.
Right.
And I did raise some wormseed in 1952. Took it to Fleming's wormseed distillery. I got enough money to buy a bus ticket to go to California because I was classified 1A, so joined the Army out there. Spent 20 years in the Army. It was a private cadet major, so the wormseed money got me to California.
Sure.
I didn't have to take basic training at Fort Jackson. I was able to take it past the road to California.
I have heard some talk about local veterinarians using some to treat farm animals. for worms, parasites. I don't know, I don't have anything to back that up, but I think that's a possibility that they were educated to the point they knew how to mix it and use it. But I don't think anybody ever done
Yeah,
anything with it.
Larry, that gentleman there, he's got something, he burned his horses, right?
And
Ma'am.
when my wife went on the computer, it says it's toxic, but my horses worked for me for about 20 years. I learned this from an old man that did it for 20 years. It seems to work. Brown can do chewing tobacco and wormseed, it seems to work. You have to put it, somewhere to breathe. That I saved last year, molded, and you don't give a horse mold.
We have a display up here. It's some wormseed plants growing. There's one there in a pot. Ed has grown these. It's starting to get seed on the top. Now, that's nothing the size of what we grew as wormseed growers. It got about 3 feet tall,
Right.
and it usually filled the row out in width. If you had 36-inch rows, 36 or 40 inch. But it's also got photographs.
I got seed there.
And the seed, you got some oil?
No.
No oil.
I got capsules like they probably looked like, had people make up a capsule, what the capsule would look like. And also got formula there for how they made wormseed mixture together. That's Doris Hall gave me that, and also a bottle. It's called Vermifuge. And what's the technical name of it? Chenopodium, right?
Chenopodium oil. Chenopodium oil. If you go on the internet, that's the chemical name.
Hello, over here. Woo. Hi. My question is, it sounds like to me that wormseed was really toxic. So, before it was cooked, is that where it was most toxic? No.
It's only the oil is toxic.
Only the oil?
Yeah.
Well,
Once-
let me ask you this. So you folks, it's kind of like moonshine, it's sounding like to me. You had to know how long and at what temperatures to cook that so that it wasn't harmful to man or animal. Is that right? I mean, that was the skill you had to know.
Well, the cooking process in the kettles, depending on the size, there's all size kettles. I think their distillery was 6 feet in diameter and 7 feet deep. The ones in Woodbine were much bigger. But it took anywhere from 45 minutes usually to an hour of steam to distill all the oil out of the plants. In fact, we used to thresh we called it herb, the cooked herb, dry, and we would thresh it with a threshing machine, the same as you'd thresh wheat, and the seeds could be fed to animals.
Yeah.
And then most of the herb was put back on the soil and plowed under as manure, as fertilizer.
Well, you showed, I guess it was the horses, and you said after the wheat was cooked down, I know it wasn't the seed, it was just the wheat itself. But then it was safe for them to eat. But if they saw that out in the field and tried to eat it before you cooked it, would that have done them in?
They won't try to eat it.
Would they eat it in the field when it's green?
No. Oh, no, they wouldn't eat it. No insects, nothing would eat wormseed.
Okay.
Didn't have to worry about pesticides, and make sure you didn't use weed killer, you'd kill it.
Right.
In fact, Ed had some out at the farm museum, and I guess the guys taking care of the landscape out there sprayed some of it with weed killer. So we had to start over, but he hasn't grown again.
Yeah, I got it growing there again now.
Yes, I was born into a wormseed family, and we had a school on. Just talking.
I can't hear you.
And I really enjoyed this, and I go along with pretty much everything that's been said. There's always some little scattered things here or there, this or that. One thing I wanted to add was, in our family, we did use it as a wormseed cure for worms for the humans and the animals. And I myself have taken a couple times a few drops of wormseed oil on a spoonful of sugar, and then followed up with a physic later on. And I can go along with a lot of these things, but I remember that seed in my shoes in a cool morning. I was sitting down to cry, and it hurt so bad. And my memory's not the greatest anymore, but I have been involved in all phases of it. The stilling and the drawing the water down to get the oil off the top, and the tester. Some oil would not test. There's a certain test before it was saleable, and some oil did not test enough. And we usually used, the re-distill was usually a high test oil. So we would mix the two together to bring it up so we would have more to sell. Well, I can talk on forever, but I won't. Thank you very much.
Well, you're right. The testing, the oil was tested for weight. I had one of the testers that my dad had, but I can't locate it. But if it was a lighter weight, you were docked on the price when you resold it. But what they did was tried to mix it with the heavier oil so it averaged out and they got the full price.
Right, better grade.
I never heard of wormseed oil until I came to Carroll County. Is it grown in other places?
I think it was like a weed naturally we're staying, but from what I understand, it's all up and down the East Coast. I mean, it's a weed, but actually our soil here, from what I understand, made the grade of oil here, and our soil we had here was more productive than anywhere. That's why this region, now, I think as far as I know, Montgomery County, Howard County, and a little bit of Frederick County, and of course Carroll, where it's mainly growing. Actually, it was known as the vulnerable oil too.
Yep. Richard?
Somebody smell of it.
The smell of it? Oh, well, I thought the seeds are black, and I called it black gold, and it smelled like money to me. You know, we had a saying in the wormseed growers, if you got something new, like some machinery, maybe a pickup truck, or maybe like me, a little tractor, hey, there's a lot of camaraderie around people loading wormseed at night and talking. They say, he wouldn't have bought that unless he sold his wormseed oil. So that was the saying. Every time you got something new, he sold his wormseed oil. They kept tabs on you.
I think we've got time for one more question, and then you can, you're free to come up and look at what Ed and Larry have on the table.
Oh, excuse me. You didn't hear me. In my family, I understood that some of my ancestors were some of the first to cook out wormseed oil, and they did it on a kitchen stove. And you know, I think about this quite a bit. It has to be distilled. And I have a notion some people distill other than wormseed on their kitchen stove.
Well, they could have. My dad talked about cutting it, the branches off with a butcher knife, because they put it in small pots. They didn't put the whole stalk no way would fit. And they had small pots. And, you know, you can take a wormseed distillery and use all copper tubing and copper pipe and make moonshine. So I think they made moonshine 150 years ago, so I'm sure they made wormseed oil.
Yeah, my grandfather had often laughed. He had a preacher come with wormseed distill, and then I think he's from West Virginia, and he said, boy, them fellows down there in Carroll County, they don't have stills everywhere.
All right, well, thank you all very much. We appreciate it.